We'll try to speak up. We'll speak up. Mindy asked, what's my infatuation with George Washington? Well, that infatuation I never saw this coming. And in fact, just about all my books, I never thought I'd write about the Pilgrims, the most boring people on earth. That's why you should never ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because you just don't know where it's all going to lead. And I never saw George Washington coming. I grew up with him on the $1 bill. Nothing could have been more uninspiring than the $1 bill. And then George arrived at the end of Bunker Hill. The battle is the obvious climax of that book, but a few weeks later arrives George Washington from Virginia to take charge of the provincial army. And this was not the George on the $1 bill. This was George in his early 40s, red-haired, fiery, aggressive, and didn't like the New Englanders one bit. They didn't give him, if he gave them an order, they'd say, because they grew up with the town meeting, that wonderful institution we still have on Nantucket. And so when he'd give them an order, they'd say, okay, wait a minute. We will discuss whether or not we want to fulfill your order. And if we do, we'd be happy to do it. And this attitude just drove him crazy. And so I just wanted to follow. I just needed to see what would happen next. So that led to Valiant Ambition, my second book about the Revolution that pairs him with Benedict Arnold. And there you see in the 4 years covered in that book, in the middle years of the Revolution, where what begins so gloriously, climaxing with the two battles at Trenton and Princeton, devolves into a squalid civil war. I mean, it's just American against American, loyalist against patriot. There's nothing inspiring about it. And this is when George Washington begins to emerge as more than a military leader, as truly the leader of the country. And it's really I was impressed by, it's his political, he was an okay general, but he was a brilliant politician. And it was he weathered a few political storms when there were efforts to try to oust him from command after the British took over Philadelphia, but he got through that. And he would emerge from that period in the fall of 1780 as the undisputed leader of the army and really of the country. And that's where In the Hurricane's Eye begins. And, I just had to see this thing to the end. And having lived on Nantucket for 33 years, the sea was important to me before moving here. It's become even more so. And I knew that there was a big naval battle that made possible the victory at Yorktown. But I really didn't understand the importance of the sea to the ultimate fate of the revolution. But I also didn't understand that George had this intimate relationship with the sea. We think of him as permanently attached to his horse. But he grew up in the Tidewater beside a river. When he was 14, he wanted to be a Navy midshipman. Can you imagine that? He had his literally bags packed when his mother, who was a recent widower, said, you can't go. And so that was a disappointment. He then, when he was 19, with his older half-brother Lawrence, went on sailed to Barbados and back. And he knew the sea. And he recognized as soon as France entered the war on our behalf in 1778, that what he needed, if he was going to win this thing, because the American people had turned their backs on the revolution, they were unwilling to pay the taxes required to fund his army, which was withering on the vine. Recruitment levels were at all-time low level. The only way he was going to be able to win this was with the help of the French Navy. And so I had to follow George into the realm I sort of thought I knew, but with George, I realized I didn't. And 1780 is George Washington's been battling for 5 years, frustrated, and this is when he realizes he needs the French.
Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned Benedict Arnold, and we think Benedict Arnold, the traitor, right? But Benedict Arnold and George Washington were actually very close. And this was a real shock to George Washington. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, we think of Benedict Arnold as evil incarnate. And but the truth of the matter is, the beginning of the Revolution, he was our best field general. And he also had an incredible strategic sense. He immediately recognized that the fort at Ticonderoga was absolutely key to guarding the corridor of water that reaches from New York up the Hudson through Lake Champlain to Canada. And he was there. He did all sorts of heroics that we don't have time to go into now. And Washington recognized this and was very much a pro-Benedict Arnold. And then after one of his more brilliant performances at the Battle of Valcour Island, a naval battle on Lake Champlain that prevented the British from basically winning the revolution in 1776, he was denied the promotion he was deserved by Congress. A dysfunctional Congress is nothing new. And they decided to go with a quota system. And instead of giving Benedict Arnold the promotion to Major General he should have gotten, they decided that each state should have 2 Major Generals. And since Connecticut had 2, he wouldn't get one. Well, this angered Arnold, and it very much upset Washington because, he didn't have control over his own army. And so what you see over the next couple of years is Arnold's gradual disaffection with the cause. Why am I doing this? He gets terribly shot up at the Battle of Saratoga. His left leg will ultimately emerge 2 inches shorter than the other one after a musket ball to his thigh. And he goes that way. And so what I enjoyed doing was watching Arnold's descent and Washington's becoming that indispensable man that the country truly needed.
Talk a little bit about his relationship with Lafayette.
Oh, Washington did not have any natural children of his own. And he met Lafayette when he was barely 20. Lafayette had, in a burst of French idealism, had come across the ocean even before France entered the war, and wanted to be in our army. And this was Washington. The last thing Washington needed was another French. There were a lot of French officers trying to do this, and so he looked at him with a very cocked eyebrow, but eventually Lafayette had this wonderful ability to win just about anyone over. And it wasn't long before Lafayette became the son Washington never had. And Lafayette, who had lost his father when he was very young, Washington became the father he never had.
And you might say, why would the French want to help us, right? The French were looking for revenge.
Right. Revanche,
Yes.
as they this even before the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, in France, which would lose Canada to Great Britain, its ally Spain would lose Florida, Alabama, New Orleans to the British. Even before that war was over, they were trying to figure out how can we get back to where we once were. And so what they saw with this little colonial rebellion was an opportunity to get back at Great Britain. And so, yes, they wanted us to win our independence, but they had their own agenda, and it was to serve their own purposes. And that's something Washington quickly learned when it came to the alliance.
Since we're talking about relationships, the relationship with Alexander Hamilton and the tiff.
Yeah.
How many have seen Hamilton? Yeah, it really got everybody's looking at history, right? So talk a little bit about that tiff and created that.
Well, yeah, Alexander Hamilton, and boy, what a great.
Another smart guy.
Yeah. And Washington was brilliant, but not like Hamilton. Hamilton was a genius. I mean, he could, he could encapsulate all the ideas swirling around at this very fertile time. I mean, to get at any point in history, it's when things are beginning where it's truly creative. And Hamilton was one of those people right in the midst of it. And you just see the ideas going through them. He's just seeing he's seeing where it's all going to go 200 years later. He's recognizing that 2 months into his introduction to all this. He's just an amazing figure. And he was just a kid at the point. But Washington was a great judge of talent. And he immediately recognized that this young artillery officer was more than the usual. And so he became an indispensable part of Washington's staff. And, some of the better letters Washington wrote owe a lot to Hamilton. But the year I talk about in The Hurricane's Eye, this is the year of Yorktown. This is where Washington everyone realized, that if it doesn't end favorably this year, the French are going to quit because it's been going on much longer than they anticipated. Their budget's blown. And if it doesn't go well, it's the end of America, because Great Britain will retain enough of this country to make it impossible for the United States to exist. And so the tensions on Washington are immense. And he's having to work with the French in this alliance, who have their own agenda, and it's tense. And he's at his headquarters in a house on the banks of the Hudson. They're none other than Benedict Arnold, a newly minted brigadier general in the British Army, had been sent into the Chesapeake with a small army, and he had ravaged the Tidewater, burning Richmond. This is Washington's home ground. You don't do this. So what does Washington do? He's going to send Lafayette down there, his surrogate son. And they're in the midst of planning this, and they're in the headquarters, and Lafayette's down there talking with everybody, trying to get all his supplies ready. Hamilton's working with Washington in his upstairs office. He has a letter he needs to get to one of the other secretaries to get things going for all this. So and Washington says, "I need to talk to you." And Hamilton says, "Well, I need to get this to the right person. I'll be right back." He goes downstairs. He's doing that. Lafayette buttonholes him and starts talking to him and is very excited. Lafayette was very endearing and very demanding. And Hamilton's like, "Okay, I got to go upstairs." Lafayette's going on. And finally Hamilton says, "I got to go." By the time he starts up the stairs, Washington is standing at the head of the staircase in a towering rage. He says to Hamilton, "You do me a disservice, sir, for making me wait this long." Hamilton says, "That was not my intention, and if that is what you think, with this we part." And thus would end one of the great collaborations of the war. But and I was amazed by the emotional nature of Washington, this man of marble during this year. But the thing about Washington, he could express anger, and as witnesses to his anger said, no one could be angrier than George Washington. But he also had once he had expressed those, usually privately, he would reassess things and then move on. And Hamilton assumed after he left the army that was it. Washington would never let him back. Washington made it clear to him through other officers that no, that's not the case. And when it came down to marching down to Yorktown just a few months later, Hamilton was given the command he deserved.
So George Washington is frustrated with the French, and he decides to write a letter to his cousin who's taking care of Mount Vernon. And that letter gets intercepted and published.
Yes. Boy, WikiLeaks is nothing new. I mean, can you imagine? And see, what's interesting, Washington was a man of great circumspection. I mean, he knew enough and letters were getting stolen all the time. And he wrote not one letter critical of the French. He wrote 5. It was the one to his cousin that happened to be intercepted. And it was immediately published. And what it said was Washington was very upset with the French. He had this plan to get Benedict Arnold. The French had wasted a week twiddling their thumbs in Newport, and they had let the opportunity go. And he just says it. And of course, General Rochambeau in Newport reads this in the British newspaper and is not pleased. And Washington apologizes. But, not as contrite as you might think. from his point of view, message delivered. And Washington, as I said, he was an astute politician. He knew how to communicate his disfavor, and because otherwise they were not going to listen to him.
And then Lafayette is confused by this, right? Because
Yes.
he says Washington had lectured him
Right.
countless times in the past, saying not being of nature which would render it prudent to entrust them to paper.
Right. So yeah, Lafayette goes, wait a minute, why did you do this? And I think, Washington doesn't answer the question because I think it was obvious that, this is what he wanted to happen. And yeah.
Talk a little bit about Lord Cornwallis.
Lord Cornwallis. Well, he is, for my money, one of the more fascinating figures of the Revolution, a kind of enigma. He did not have a good record during the Revolution. Earlier in the war, at what's called the Second Battle of Trenton, after, we all know about when Washington went through across the ice-clotted Delaware River and through a snowstorm, surprised the Hessians and, turned the tide. What is less known is just a few weeks later, Washington goes back across the Delaware and is back in Trenton, and General Howe up in New York is apoplectic and sends Cornwallis down to get him. Cornwallis and a large army comes down to get him. And if you go to Morristown, to Trenton today, there is a small bridge across the river there, a stone bridge. It's not the same stone bridge, but it's pretty much in the same place. And rather than doing an end run around Washington, Cornwallis decided to just go at him across this little bridge. And wave after wave of soldiers would go across. It was terribly bloody. Eventually night comes on, and the next morning, Washington escapes by heading out at night towards Princeton. And it's just one of the great escape. Washington was an incredible escape artist, but this does not reflect well on Cornwallis. Cornwallis goes back to England. Eventually, his wife dies. He was absolutely dedicated to his wife. Apparently, most of the British officers had affairs, it was obvious, but Cornwallis was different. And when his wife died, it destroyed him. And as he would write to his brother, everything is lost for me in England. I think I'm going to go back to America, even though there's little chance for glory in this war. And so he would end up down south, battling Nathaniel Greene, that great fighting Quaker. We love our fighting Quakers here in this wonderful hall. And Cornwallis his orders were to just keep a lid on South Carolina. We're going to occupy South Carolina. If things go right over the next few months, this is all going to wind down and Britain's going to win the thing. But Cornwallis goes on the offensive. He just goes at Nathaniel Greene. And they have what's known as the race across to the Dan. They have a race diagonally across the width of North Carolina in the sucking red mud of North Carolina in February and March. And if I was just in North Carolina, and it's still that way. And Greene, who was very methodical, very strategic-minded, could not understand what Cornwallis was doing because Cornwallis had this small force. And to catch up to Greene, he decided to burn his supply wagons so that the men were traveling light. He burns the stuff, and in almost a ceremonial fire. And then off they go, and they begin this race. Nathaniel Greene, brilliantly using the rivers, it all comes down to water, had frontmen who would find ferry boats. They would come to the edge of these rain-swollen rivers, get across, then make sure all the boats were on the other side. Cornwallis would get to the river and no way across. And then he'd have to go up the river to where he could cross by foot. And gradually, Greene, even though his army is slower moving, makes it to Virginia, where it is a kind of safe haven where he can recoup. And ultimately, he and Cornwallis meet at one of the great battles of the Revolution, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Cornwallis would nominally win because he would have possession of the field, but he was eviscerated by Greene's army. Half of his best officers and men had been wounded or killed. And he would retreat to Wilmington, North Carolina. He should have gone back to South Carolina and recoup what was there. But once again, he goes on the offensive. He goes into Virginia and ultimately would end up at a little hamlet we know as Yorktown.
One of the things I love about your books is you think you know the history, right? And then you read, you go, I didn't know that. Or you find these different angles that you would think people would have already discovered and written about. So this speaks, I think, to your research. Talk a little bit about what goes into, because all of your books are just meticulously researched. Talk a little bit about that.
It takes a long time.
Long time, yeah.
No, I'd say 75% of what I do is research. And I love the writing, so it's really frustrating at times, particularly when I'm just bursting to start getting it on the page and nope, keep going. But, and for me, research, there's the first year and a half of learning about a topic. And, I write these books not because I'm an expert in the field. It's because I have questions about the topic, and there's really nothing that's answering those questions, and I want to give it a try on my own. And so I research the topic, get a sense of the arc of the story I want to tell, come up with a preface, a way in. I need to find. For me, it's very important to have that first sort of couple of pages that set up the reader, because that establishes kind of the voice I'll use throughout the book. And then I start writing, but then with each chapter, and I do it chapter by chapter, as soon as I start on a chapter, it becomes obvious I need to know more about this. So then there's a whole nother level of research specific to what I'm telling in that chapter. And then I write that chapter, and then it's on to the next, and gradually, and then finally there's the end. I'm finished, and I realize, I need to sort of plug these holes and things like that.
So when you're doing your research, do you find tidbits for your next book? I think this has happened to you. We go, that's a little, I think I'll just save that for my next book.
Absolutely. I mean, they Away Offshore was written about my adopted home here. And it was researching that I read William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, I think for the first time. And I went, my God, there's a lot more to this story than I ever realized. Let me file that in some other place. And then, of course, one of those chapters is about the Essex. And it was after I had published Away Offshore, I realized, what if I thought of the Essex disaster as a survival tale, rather than a whaling tale, And so it's been that way with every book.
Mm-hmm. Do you have questions? Anybody have questions? You want to keep going, or somebody want to ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yep, Pierre, go ahead.
So I read the book last winter, and forgive me if I've forgotten. You may have covered the post-Yorktown period. I think you did. Could you review that? What sort of encapsulate the end of the war after Yorktown?
Yeah.
I was asking about post-Yorktown.
Maybe also remind us about the recognition of the United States.
Yeah. Well, the post-York, it's kind of interesting, the aftermath of Yorktown. We think of Yorktown as ending the revolution, but there was 2 more years. And it took that long to negotiate a treaty. And it was by no means a foregone conclusion that it all would work out the way it did. Just months after Admiral de Grasse, the leader of the great French fleet that won the Battle of the Chesapeake, that made the siege of Yorktown a fait accompli, just months after that great victory, he gets defeated by Admiral Rodney in the Caribbean. And it looks like Washington is fearful, oh my gosh, they're just going to come roaring back. And it's all lost. Luckily, the British people were sick of war, and that's the course they would get out of it. But, it was up in the balance. And then it takes 2 years, and it's March 1783. This is 2 years after Yorktown. Washington's army is stationed in Newburgh, New York, on the Hudson, and his officers haven't been paid. And we have talk about a dysfunctional Congress. This is a Congress that had no ability to tax the people directly. There was no executive branch. nothing was going on, and there was no provisions being made to pay Washington's officers who had seen this whole thing through. And there had been mutinies before, but those had been enlisted men. Now it was the officers. And at one point, they would launch what's known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, where their plan was that they would band together, march on Philadelphia, and demand that they be treated fairly by gunpoint. This, of course, would have been the coup that would have destroyed this experiment in a republic. This is what happened to all other previous revolutions: Cromwell, Caesar, Napoleon. This was what was going to happen, and Washington knew it. So the officers had a meeting. Washington arrived very unexpectedly and delivered a very eloquent speech about, you guys have covered yourself in honor over the course of the last 7 years. To do this would throw it all away. Are you really going to do this? His officers completely unmoved. They stared at him stonily. And then, one of the things about Washington, he wasn't the most eloquent guy, but he was one of the great actors on this political stage. He loved the theater. I mean, I would wonder what he would do. He'd probably be a binge watcher on Netflix today. He just loved that kind of thing. And by this time, he had just turned 50 years old. He was having a hard time reading words on the page. That's why I've got graduated lenses. He had ordered up his first pair of spectacles from David Rittenhouse down in Philadelphia. And he had never worn them in public before. And after this speech, which leaves his officers unmoved, he says, I want to read you a letter that one of the delegates to Congress has written me in support of all of you. So he takes it out and he starts to read, and he clearly is having trouble reading the handwriting. So he says, excuse me, gentlemen, I have not only gone gray in the service of my country, but apparently I am going blind. He takes out his glasses. Everybody breaks down in tears, and he's won them over. He quickly leaves. Henry Knox stands up and says, I move that we do whatever George Washington tells us to do. And it's completely agreed upon. George Washington saves America at that moment. He would then, a few months later, in November 1783, the British evacuate New York. He has a very emotional farewell with a small group of officers in Fraunces Tavern. The room where that happened is still there, and I was just there last week. And then he goes to Annapolis to meet with the Continental Congress. Why are they in Annapolis? Because they're fearful they're going to be attacked by their own army. So they move from Philadelphia to Annapolis. I mean, we have just the barest window dressing of a government here. And it takes them 2 weeks to get a quorum, so he just cools his heels waiting. And then his decision is to surrender his military commission to Congress. When King George III hears that this is Washington's intention, he says to Benjamin West, the American-born painter in London, he says to him, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. That's exactly what Washington does. He just wanted to go home. And so he would arrive at Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve of 1783. And that was the end of it.
Why do you think George and Martha didn't save their letters?
It was a common thing not to, but oh man, I just
love to have
and because there's evidence that George told her everything, and there's one interesting letter where this is during Yorktown, the siege of Yorktown, and Henry Knox is the American artillery chief, and his wife Lucy is staying at Mount Vernon, and Lucy writes to Henry in Yorktown saying, why aren't you writing me letters? Martha gets a letter every day from George. What's going on here? And so you just go, oh man, what was he writing? And no, she burned his correspondence at the end.
Such a shame.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? Anybody up here?
This one.
Oh, we'll hear and then we'll go there. Go ahead.
Of all the attributes of of Washington, surrounded by all these brilliant intellectuals, all pointing in different directions. Did he have a vision, a straight line vision, or did he manipulate them? What was the peculiar genius that made Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison respected and admired?
Yeah. Well, as Jefferson would say, he had a great mind, but not of the highest order, which he meant, he didn't have that brilliance of a Jefferson or a Hamilton, but he had a different kind of brilliance. He had an ability to dial out the static of life, all that stuff that I think we have even more of today, and figure out what really matters. What is the most important thing for me to do? And in the early years of the war, he was naturally aggressive. He wanted to fight it out with the British. He realized, no, I could lose everything. I need to fight a defensive war. He pursued that. As soon as the French come into the war, he realizes what I need is naval superiority. That becomes his overriding focus. He finally achieves that. As soon as, after Yorktown, he begins writing letters to people about the need for a stronger central government. That has been the source of his ultimate frustration throughout the revolution. As he said, this was much worse than the British, who was having to deal with his own government. And so that becomes his focus, a strong federal government. And then, he becomes president, invents the presidency, because the Constitution has only the sketchiest description of what a president will actually do. And then he realizes it's the Union. It's the Union. Everything comes down to the states surrendering their specific interests to the greater good of the whole. It comes down to that. And then by this time, and midway through his two-term administration, he realizes that the greatest threat to the Union is slavery. And he's overheard by Jefferson in a cabinet meeting saying that if slavery, and was already clear that the way the country was fracturing was north-south, and he says, if it comes down to a break, I will go with the northern part, which is an absolutely he was still a slave owner, yes. He was not perfect by any means, but on his, he would be the one slave-holding founding father to free his slaves at the end. And this was a very calculated decision. He knew this would be trumpeted around the country. And it was his final statement on the issue.
Just had a question. I love Nat's books about the revolution, but we're on Nantucket, and maybe you just remind us how the revolution went over here.
Oh, yeah, the revolution.
Went over here.
How did the revolution? Well, we didn't like the revolution here. It was a terrible idea because all our oil went to London. And so it was a very difficult thing. And the economy was completely shut down. There were several whaling merchants with obvious loyalist tendencies. The island would be a kind of bauble in the hands of both the Continental and British forces. The Patriots hated us because we were obviously just latent loyalists, and meanwhile, the British Navy was ransacking the coast, burning New Bedford. They did some bad things in Martha's Vineyard. They were headed for Nantucket, but what's known as the Quaker wind, it blew out of the east and prevented them from coming. And this would all happen again in the War of 1812, and the Nantucketers would have the audacity to negotiate their own private treaty with the British Navy. That did not go over well with the rest of America. And that's why I love this island. I mean, we're such a weird little microcosm, but yet so typical. And but it was a difficult time. Particularly there was the hard winter of 1780. It was historically cold and snow everywhere on the East Coast. But here it was really tough because the ice made it impossible for supply ships to come in. The harbor froze completely over. There wasn't a stick of wood left except for that cedar forest out there in, what's that? Cascada, right? Cascada. Sorry, I just might. In Cascada, so that was then denuded, and people were eating rats and seagulls. But yeah, it wasn't fun here.
Another question?
Hey, will someone ask what's my next book?
I was going to ask that. That was going to be my last.
Okay, you can go ahead.
All right. But before we ask about the next book, you write a lot about history, but you wrote that book about yourself and sailing.
Yes.
Which was
Second Wind.
Has anybody read that? Wasn't that just delightful? I loved that because, boy, we saw the competitive nature you have in your head there. All right, so what are you working on now?
Well, just a word about Second Wind.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, yes, I was a younger then. It's funny. That's all around the year I wrote Away Offshore, my first work of history, and I was at home with the kids, and that was the year Ethan got into first grade, so I had till 2:30 in the afternoon, and so that just changed everything, and so I was very pent up. So it was, it was, anyways.
But you should read it.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Okay. What's next? Well, I've had enough of bloodshed for a while, after writing 3 books about the revolution. But I'm still fascinated with George. I got to see where he's going next. And when George Washington became president, he realized he was the leader of 13 essentially independent states. There was really no genuine sense of nationhood. When a Virginian said his country, he meant Virginia. He did not mean the United States. And so Washington decides to go on a road trip. He decides he needs to visit all 13 states. And so he would travel not in Air Force One, but in a carriage pulled by 4 horses. He would travel with an entourage of 2 aides. And he would go to all the little towns throughout New England. He'd wait till Congress went into recess. And then he headed out. He went for a month-long trip that took him all the way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. During a harbor tour, he even stepped out onto Kittery Point. And then and this was when New York was the temporary capital of the country. The capital would move to Philadelphia. And in 1791, he went on a southern tour that would take him all the way down to Savannah. And even though he was a Virginian, he had never been south of Virginia. And so everywhere he went, when he would come to a town, he would get out of the coach and get up on his horse with his general's uniform and ride into town to huge applause. He did have that theatrical sense. But everywhere he went, he showed these people that they're part of something more than their town, their state, they're part of the United States. And so Melissa and I and our dog Dora have set out on a road trip retracing Washington's travels. And so the books will be sort of in the Second Wind mode. It's going to be as much travelogue as a history of Washington's travels. It's going to be called, at least for now, Travels with George in Search of Washington's America.
And I bet we will find all kinds of interesting things that we did not know, and you probably didn't know when you set out on the trip. That's part of the beauty. The book, The Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and Victory at Yorktown, they're going to be selling them in the back room here, and that's going to sign books for you. Thank you all for coming out in the rain.
And thank you, Mindy. Okay.